Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for our last History Happy Hour of 2020. I want to thank our season sponsor, Therian Waddell Construction Group, who has been sponsoring the History Happy Hour series, I think since the year it started, which has been about 7 years now. So thank you for that generous contribution to help these series be carrying on for so long. My name is Allison Weiss, and I'm the director of the museum, and I want to welcome those of you who have been with us many times and those of you who are attending our program for the first time. We always start off with a statement about the background of the museum land. During these very difficult times that we've experienced as individuals and as a country, Sandy Spring Museum too has experienced challenges grappling with the new role we play in a system that benefits some at the expense of others. Sandy Spring Museum stands firmly with those fighting against racism, structural disadvantages, and systemic injustice that have oppressed Black people in the United States for hundreds of years. The United States was built on discriminatory practices that were codified in our legal system, beginning with the dehumanization of Native people, followed by enslaving Black people in bondage as property for the financial benefit of those of white European ancestry. Sandy Spring Museum itself stands on land that was once a plantation where Black people were enslaved. We recognize that the museum is the beneficiary of a historically unjust system, and we're committed to working towards dismantling systems that perpetuate racism and discrimination in order to build a just, equal society. And tonight's program is just one of many programs that we host that challenge the dominant narrative. With that, I would like to introduce our co-moderators. We're starting a new format with our programs that instead of me serving as the moderator, we're going to be having special guests serve as our moderator. So I'd like to introduce Thomas Y. Canby, a native Sandy Springer, who is a former science editor for National Geographic magazine and the author of 23 science articles. He's a former Sandy Spring Museum trustee, serving at the time that the facility moved to its present location. He's authored numerous publications about historic Sandy Spring. And his wife, Susan Pfeiffer Canby, retired from the National Geographic Society as Vice President of Libraries and Information Services with 35 years of experience. She and her staff worked with the Society's writers, photographers, artists, scientists, explorers, filmmakers, and business staff to get the information they needed when or before they needed it. Susan is a past president of Sandy Spring Museum Board of Trustees, a distinguished graduate of the University of Maryland, and a former leader of local, national, and international library associations. Thank you so much, Susan and Tom, for agreeing to be our co-moderators.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you for your great work with the Sandy Spring Museum. It is much appreciated by all. Susan and I are delighted to be part of this evening. The museum is a wonderful asset for residents of Montgomery and Howard counties and for blossoming online communities. A little more background. As Allison mentioned, I'm a science editor for the Geographic magazine, wrote a number of articles and worked with scientists on many, many more. Susan, a Geographic vice president, made sure that writers and photographers had the best information about our world and its peoples. We felt fortunate to work at an institution so concerned about this world. Susan.
Hello, everybody. Our speaker invites us to present questions after his presentation, but while he's speaking and you have a question, you can add it to the chat area. If you look on your screen, you'll see probably at the bottom a little chat area, and you can just add in your question as you think about it, and we'll summarize them at the end.
It's a pleasure to work with our speaker. Our careers, his and mine, are similar in many ways, except that mine was a half century earlier. Our guest, George Zaidan, wears many hats. He is a science communicator, a television and web host, a producer. He created National Geographic's web series, Ingredients, the Stuff Inside Your Stuff. He co-wrote and directed MIT's web series, Science Out Loud. His work has been featured in the New York Times, in Wired, Forbes, the Boston Globe, National Geographic magazine, NPR's The Salt, and numerous other places. He is currently the executive producer at the American Chemical Society. Last April, George published his first book, Ingredients, the Strange Chemistry of What We Put in Us and On Us. George Zaidan.
Thank you very much for that kind and generous introduction. And thanks to everyone who helped put this event together. I really appreciate you all having me. So here's the book. It was kind of an accident. When I started writing, the idea of how scientists decide what's true or not true was not remotely in my mind. I got to the topic by maybe the most convoluted route possible. So what I want to do tonight is start where I started, which is going to seem very far removed from the search for truth, and then take you on an abbreviated version of the journey that I myself went on over the past 5 years. So 5 years ago, I was producing a show for National Geographic's YouTube channel. And the idea of the show was to see if I could take regular household products and recreate them using only all natural ingredients. Some of the stuff was fairly easy. It turns out you can make a fantastic lipstick from a few different types of oils, beeswax, and some rust. And the rust is actually what makes it red. But pretty much everything else that I tried to make was impossible. I tried making hand sanitizer gel and failed miserably, unfortunately for me, during the start of this pandemic. So for me, the takeaway from that series was that as a civilization, we live in a weird paradox. On the one hand, we derive everything that we eat, drink, breathe, and use from nature. But most of the things that we use on a daily basis are incredibly far removed from nature. Here's an example. So the computer monitor that all of us are staring into right now is 100% natural. The plastic casing is made from oil, which is fossilized plankton from hundreds of millions of years ago. All the metals come from a relatively thin layer of the Earth's crust. Every single atom in this thing can be traced back to the natural world. But a time traveler from 100 years ago would look at this and think that it was magic. So, we can do the same exercise with a head of lettuce. It seems very natural, very pure and intact from nature. But we've been breeding lettuce for 2,000 years, which means we've been changing its genome, its DNA. We've changed the code that makes lettuce lettuce. If you want to have a fun argument with someone, try convincing them that a computer monitor is more natural than a head of lettuce. I am not going to try and make that argument. But I'm happy to make the argument that almost nothing around us is, quote, pure and intact from nature. In other words, if humanity was not, didn't exist, lettuce might look very, very different. So that's kind of where my brain was when I was making this show for National Geographic. And as you can imagine, that's kind of a weird place for a brain to be. And it raises the question, especially about food, is natural stuff better for you? Or if you use the same question with different words, is processed food bad for you? And if so, how bad? So we all think we know the answer to this question, which is yes, it is, and very bad. And I thought, okay, I'm going to write a book that explains why processed food is bad for you on a chemical level. To do that, I first had to explain how scientists confirmed that processed food is in fact bad for you. And that sounds like it would be really easy. It was not. So if you do a bit of Googling, you'll find a few recent studies that link processed food to a whole bunch of diseases and even to an early death. One of the more recent studies was published by a group in France, and the headline result was this. For every 10% increase in the proportion by weight of processed food in participants' diet, their annual risk of death went up by 14%. Now that sounds like a lot. That sounds like a huge change. But if you translate that into life expectancy, it's about a 1.3 year loss of life expectancy. So the study found that people who ate 10% more processed food tended to live on average about 1.3 years less. Now, $1 million question. Is that true? If you were eating a bag of Cheetos every day before, and you up your consumption to a bag plus 4 Cheetos, which is about an extra 10%, do you then live 1.3 years less? Now, before we answer that, I want to point out a few things. First, most non-scientists and non-journalists don't pause and ask themselves if something is really true. They're not trained to. They, and I'm including myself in this, we typically just read the headline in the New York Times, internalize it, and then move on with our day. Second thing, so in my opinion, the question, is this really true, is the most important question we all have to ask ourselves when we come across any headline about science, especially now. And that's kind of what I call healthy skepticism. And we'll come back to why I'm saying healthy in a second. The third thing is that asking whether people who eat more Cheetos die sooner is fundamentally the same as asking a question like, is the Pfizer corona vaccine really 95% effective? And we'll also come back to that a bit later, because that is going to turn out to be one of the most important scientific questions of the decade. So let's go back to this idea of healthy skepticism. Healthy skepticism, I think, is one of the most important tools in your mental toolkit. And by the way, it is not the same as automatic disbelief. Healthy skepticism is a 3-step process. First, asking yourself if something is really true. Second, doing a bit of directed research. And third, making a slightly more informed decision than you would have made before you did step 1 and 2. Now, depending on what your research uncovers, healthy skepticism can, and often does, reinforce or strengthen your belief. So now we're going to spend a little time being healthily skeptical about that processed food study from earlier. And we're going to do that by comparing it to certain aspects of the Pfizer and also the Moderna vaccine trials. So let's start with the processed food study. Before we get to the actual data, let's step back and ask what kind of study it was. There are 2 main study types. The first is what's called a randomized controlled trial, or an RCT. And the second is an observational study. RCTs are considered the gold standard, especially in medicine. So if you wanted to test whether aspirin really does get rid of a headache, you'd get a big group of volunteers, you'd randomly assign them to be in 2 different groups, you'd blast really loud music to give both groups a headache, and then you'd give one group aspirin and another group a sugar pill. And you'd count how many headaches there were in each group. That's an RCT. The processed food study was an observational study. So what that means is, instead of randomly assigning people to be in a high processed food group or a low processed food group, you don't assign anyone at all. You just sort of let people live their lives, and you track how much processed food they eat. Some people will eat less, some people will eat more, and you follow those people for years, sometimes decades, until enough of them die that you have enough statistical power to find what you want to find. Then you sort of, count how many processed food eaters died versus people who ate less processed food. That's an observational study. Now, observational studies have strengths. They're relatively cheap, and you can run them for decades, but they also have major weaknesses, one of which is something called confounding. So confounding is when 2 or more variables are tied together and difficult to untangle. So, for example, in the processed food study, yes, people who eat more processed food do indeed die sooner, but those people are also more likely to smoke, be less physically active, and be less wealthy. By contrast, people who eat less processed food are less likely to smoke, be more physically active, and be more wealthy. So then you have to ask the question, what's actually causing the people who eat more processed food to die sooner? Is it the processed food, or is it the smoking, the lack of exercise, and the less access to quality healthcare? Now, you can, in theory, try to correct mathematically for these differences, but it's difficult to do, and it's never really clear that you've done it accurately. So in contrast, randomized controlled trials typically do not suffer from confounding problems. And that's why the phase 3 vaccine trials are usually randomized controlled trials. The Pfizer trial, the Moderna trial, they're both RCTs. And they randomly assigned participants to either receive the vaccine or a placebo shot. So let's play a fun thought experiment. Imagine for a second if the vaccine trials were observational. Instead of randomly assigning people to get a vaccine or a placebo, you would have to let people decide whether to get the vaccine or not. And as you are immediately realizing, the type of person who would choose to get the vaccine is probably very different than the type of person who would choose to not get the vaccine. The former is probably more likely to wear a mask or social distance. So you could imagine a scenario in which you have lots of people choosing to get a vaccine, and then they go and lock themselves in their basement for 3 months, which would mean they wouldn't get COVID, but it wouldn't have anything to do with the vaccine. So all that is to say, if the vaccine trials were observational, I would be much, much less confident in their results. And because they're not observational, because they're randomized controlled trials, I'm much more confident in their results. So let's jump back to the processed food study for a second. There are other problems with it other than it being an observational study. You've probably already thought of this, but if you're trying to figure out how processed food affects people's lifespan, you have to accurately measure how much processed food people are eating. Now, theoretically, you could try and keep track of every single meal that thousands of people eat over the course of decades, but that's a logistical nightmare and would cost a fortune. Instead, what these studies usually do is email people a questionnaire once or twice a year. And I'm going to read you one of the questions from this is an actual question that really appeared on one of these studies. How often, on average, did you eat 6 ounces or 1 serving of French fries over the past year? Never, less than once a month, 1 to 3 times a month, once a week, 2 to 4 times a week, 5 to 6 times a week, or 1 or more servings a day. Now, there are lots of issues with questions like this. The first is, can you even picture what 6 ounces of French fries looks like? I mean, I couldn't. I thought it was a medium at McDonald's, but it's not. It's actually closer to a large. The second issue is you have to remember how often you eat a serving of fries. Most people can barely remember what they ate 3 days ago, let alone accurately average, French fry consumption over an entire year. And the third issue is, even if you can accurately remember how often you ate every single food, you might just lie. You might say, yeah, my diet's a perfect food pyramid. I never go to McDonald's. So observational trials about food often rely on this type of self-reported data. And that means you're relying on people accurately remembering their diet over the course of a year and then not lying to you about it. Let's contrast this with vaccine trials, right? You are not asking anyone to remember, did you get your shot? Did you get a vaccine? You are administering the vaccine, so you know exactly who got it and who didn't. The other half of that equation is you have to check to see who ends up getting COVID. Now there you have a little more uncertainty because people drop out of the study. You can have asymptomatic cases, but there's certainly less uncertainty than in an observational trial where you're just emailing someone and asking them to tell you what they did. The last aspect of the vaccine trials that I want to talk about is what scientists call effect size. So effect size basically means how obvious is this result? And we're going to look at the Moderna numbers because I've picked on Pfizer enough so far. So the trial enrolled about 30,000 participants, of which 15,000 would have gotten the placebo and 15,000 would have gotten the vaccine. And then those 30,000 people go about their lives. Some of them start getting sick. And you keep track of how many people get sick in the vaccine group versus the placebo group. So suppose that in the vaccine group, and I'm making these numbers up, 100 people get sick, and then in the placebo group, 100 people also get sick. In that case, the vaccine's totally useless. It made no difference whether you got the placebo versus the vaccine. Now suppose that 50 people in the vaccine group get sick and 100 people in the placebo group get sick. That's starting to look better. The vaccine prevented about half the cases that you would have expected. Now the real data is even more impressive. In the real data, 90 people in the placebo group got sick and only 5 people in the vaccine group did. And Pfizer's data is pretty much the same. So now I want to talk about statistics. So in most studies about health, whether they're randomized controlled trials or whether they're observational, you're usually comparing 2 numbers. And there's always some variation due to random chance within each group. So most of the time, scientists will use a group of statistical methods to help them figure out, is the difference between these 2 numbers real, or is it likely to be random chance? At some point, though, your results become impressive enough that you don't need statistics, really. And both of the trials, the Pfizer and Moderna trials, fall into this category. By contrast, observational trials, especially those about food, generally don't produce huge effect sizes. So the processed food study from earlier found that people who ate more processed food had a 14% higher risk of death than people who ate less. If you did the analogous math for the Moderna trial, you'd find that people in the unvaccinated group were 1,900% more likely to get COVID than people in the vaccinated group. Now, that's not a completely fair comparison because we're comparing death in one instance with getting a disease in another. But even when observational studies look at specific diseases and not death, they rarely find risks larger than 50%. Compare that to 1,900% and it's night and day. There is a huge sort of caveat with the vaccine studies, which is what we're doing right now is science by press release. We're not, we have not seen published papers on this yet. We're not, science by press release is not the best way to do science, but extraordinary circumstances. So back to the processed food study for a second. There are other issues with it, and there are other issues with observational studies about food in general, and I go through a lot of them in more detail in the book. But basically, the experience that I had was that this study, which I had originally thought would take like a day of research to confirm and explain, was slowly dying a death of 1,000 cuts. Okay, so I want to recap what we've covered in our sort of search for truth discussion. We looked at 3 different dimensions of how a study is done to help us evaluate whether the result is plausible. 1, is it an RCT or is it observational? 2, is the data objective or is it self-reported? And 3, how obvious are the results? How big is the effect size? Now, I've spent a lot of time sort of poo-pooing observational studies, but I do want to give them their due. Sometimes a randomized controlled trial is just not ethical. And in those cases, observational studies can really be helpful. So for example, excuse me, in the 1950s and 1960s, the studies on smoking were all observational. Ethically, you cannot force a group of people to smoke if you suspect that it causes lung cancer, so you have no choice but to do an observational study. But those studies showed huge effect sizes. For example, smokers were 1,000% more likely to get lung cancer than non-smokers. And that's a much more obvious and impressive result. So back to those 3 dimensions on how a study is done. There are way more than 3 things to consider when you're evaluating a study. And the only way really to figure out the truth or falsity of a scientific hypothesis is to look at what studies have been done, evaluate them on their merits. And then a really important thing is to acknowledge uncertainty. Sometimes you can look at a series of studies and decide, well, it's not actually really clear what the final answer is yet because that's still in process. It's going to take another 5 or 10 years before the science is really settled on this. And getting to the point where you can, reading a study is not easy. Getting to the point where you can actually read it critically and evaluate things, I would say it took a year of solid practice for me to feel sort of confident in reading studies and evaluating their claims. And it's kind of crazy that simple question, are processed foods actually bad for you, led me to a totally new perspective about how science is done, how it advances, and how to evaluate scientific information. And I wrote the book way before the pandemic, but the type of questions that I ended up answering, like how do we know whether processed food is bad for you or not, are very similar to the types of questions that we're all confronted with today. How do we know that masks work? Should you yell at a jogger who isn't wearing a mask? How do you disinfect surfaces? All of those questions are not moral, ethical, or political. They're scientific. And going through the process of researching this book, talking to people on both sides of a scientific debate, and trying to judge who was doing the stronger science really helped me filter out a lot of the wheat from the chaff when it comes to COVID news. And look, sometimes it's easy to filter that stuff out. If someone tells you to drink bleach, you can probably safely ignore that advice. But if you hear that the president got a dose of convalescent plasma while at Walter Reed, should you ask your doctor for the same thing? If you, hopefully don't, but if you end up with COVID-19, that is a scientific question, and learning how to evaluate the evidence on those things and judge them is a very, very important skill, especially now. So I'll end it there, and I will happily take any questions that you have.
We
Just a
have
minute.
37 questions from participants. Yes. I'll assert a host prerogative and go first. In your work, I'm sure you rely heavily on expertise of numerous scientists. How do you go about identifying the best authority on a subject? And once located, are these authorities usually willing to cooperate with you?
It's a great question. I started off by reading a lot of scientific papers and then finding the names that kept popping up, and especially the names that disagreed with each other. Professors love writing, opinion pieces, and then other professors will write opinion pieces that, tear that one to shreds, and they'll go back and forth for years in the literature. So finding the names that keep popping up, reaching out to them. So I think I read something like 2,000 papers or so for the book, and I ended up emailing about 160 people. And about half of them got back to me. So I interviewed, I either interviewed or I sent excerpts of the book to about 80 scientists, and we ended up corresponding. I did try and go out of my way to reach people who disagreed with each other. When it came to nutrition studies, there are the people who generally believe the last 50 years of nutrition research, and then there are people who really don't. And sometimes people are more willing to talk to you from one camp than the other. The established folks were sort of unwilling generally to talk to me. And then the people who wanted everything to burn to the ground were very interested in talking. But you just sort of persist and email people over and over again. And eventually they feel so guilty about not responding that they let you interview them for half an hour. So that's kind of what I did.
Well, as the co-host, I would like to get your response from a quote from a recent Geographic in June. It said, "Many Americans pay little attention to science. Even people who regularly watch television, news, or cable news only receive scraps of information, science information, in their media diet because mainstream outlets devote so little airtime to the subject. On top of that, some Americans may regard science as intimidating and hard to understand, so they avoid the topic altogether. I'm sure the Geographic engages you to overcome this challenge, but what strategies do you use to stimulate interest in science and help us understand complex subjects?"
Yeah, that's a great question. So I try to relate whatever it is that I'm talking about to people's everyday lives. And that is very easy these days because it's 100% coronavirus all the time in the news. When it comes to other topics, my book is fundamentally about the scientific method and the search for truth, but you would never in a million years guess that from looking at the cover. I mean, it's a giant phallic Cheeto. So the cover is very far from the subject matter of the book. So in a sense, what I'm doing is baiting and switching the audience, right? I'm hooking people with a book about food, and then they're actually going to get a book about the scientific method. And I do have a lot of angry reviews on Amazon of people upset about that bait and switch. And the last thing I try and do is use analogies and metaphors as much as possible. One of my favorite ones involves ricin, which is a poison that was used to assassinate a Bulgarian dissident in 1978. So ricin is one of the most toxic things we know of. A single molecule of ricin can kill an entire cell. Now, that sentence by itself isn't that impressive because most people don't know how big a cell is compared to how big a molecule of ricin is. So if you make it into an analogy, it becomes something like killing a cell with a molecule of ricin is like killing a person with the right leg of an ant. I mean, that's the size difference. So things like that make factoids memorable and I think more striking.
That's good. The Geographic was always good at doing that very thing to help people understand their own lives in terms of science. But it is an issue, and so it's really good you're doing what you do. I know that Allison had a question. Oh, you're not on speaker, Dawn.
Yeah. Well, I have a couple questions. I'll just stick to one to start with. It seems like we're talking a lot of now about how people don't believe scientists, but is that really anything new? Haven't people always questioned science?
Yeah, yes, there has always been, I mean, not just science, just knowledge in general. There has always been skepticism. You know, in the 1860s, there was a doctor, an Austrian doctor named Semmelweis, and he is the guy who actually invented the concept of a hand sanitizer. And the hand sanitizer that he used at the time was a chemical cousin of bleach. And he suggested that this sanitizer could reduce certain complications of pregnancy. And then he actually ran an experiment and he proved that it did. But he was ignored and ridiculed and died a few years later before the significance of his findings was really recognized. You know, and that took 2 decades before he was actually adequately recognized for his contributions. And part of the reason for that is that anytime there's new information, you know, your sort of first reaction, especially if it goes against the prevailing wisdom, your first reaction is like, well, that can't be true. And that's okay. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I think it was Carl Sagan who used to say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That's a totally healthy thing. You know, the harder thing is when you've got sort of blind and utter disbelief. And I think that's a problem with mistrust of authority. I mean, the CDC used to be uncontroversial, right? Like it was just generic health advice that people would get. And now you've got a large, well, I don't know, large is maybe stretching it, but a significant percentage of the population who thinks that the MMR vaccine causes autism. And that has impacts on all of us, right? So I don't have like an easy answer to that, other than that there's something called the Vaccine Confidence Project that I think is run out of the UK. And you know, they would know a lot more about this than I do, but yeah, skepticism has always been a problem. It's always been there. I don't think it's ever been as much of an issue in public health as it is today.
One of our viewers or members have asked, following up on that question, is how do we bring back the belief in science for those who don't believe? I could not believe that there are people who think the world is flat, but there they are.
Yeah. You know, if you haven't watched the Netflix documentary about the Earth being flat, that is a fantastic show. And not to spoil it too much, but in that series, it's not just about people who think the Earth is flat. It's about a group of them who are actively trying to prove that the Earth is flat. And so they're doing experiments that, you know, over and over again show that the Earth is round. And they do several rounds of these experiments, no pun intended. And at the end of the series, one of them does something really simple, like shining a laser beam over a long distance. And, you know, if the Earth was flat, you would expect that the beam would be flat. But because of the curvature of the Earth, the laser appears, I don't know, an inch higher than you'd expect it would, or an inch lower, or something like that. And there's this moment when the person like does the experiment, the data's in front of them, and they just go, huh. And then I think the documentary ends or something like that. But I would love to know what went on in that person's head right after that. Most of the time, unfortunately, you rationalize things. So, you know, when data comes along that contravenes something that you deeply believe, you say to yourself, oh, well, my laser was not working properly, or, well, I'll try a different experiment. You just spend, the more deeply you believe something and the more intelligent you are, the more you rationalize away inconvenient facts. So I think convincing people starts with, they first have to trust the messenger. Before you're going to get anyone to trust the message, they have to trust the messenger. And that's part of the problem, is that messengers these days, like Dr. Fauci, are, there is some level of mistrust of the messenger. And I don't have an easy solution for that. I mean, education, but that takes decades. it's really hard. It's a really hard problem.
Oh. Okay, another question is, how do we know that models of anthropogenic climate change are true? How do we convince others?
Great question. So talking of strengths of observational studies. If you really wanted to be technical about it, the data that most of the data that we have from like ice cores and looking at historical Earth temperatures and all of that stuff is observational. We don't have a placebo Earth that has no humans on it that we can like watch and see what happens, right? So we have no choice but to rely on observational data. The most striking thing to me is if you line up a graph of CO2 emissions and Earth surface temperatures, which we have like weirdly accurate records of Earth surface temperatures over the past 200 years, 300 years, because sailors and others would obsessively take measurements, sometimes more than once a day. If you line that up, I mean, there's a delay, right? Because it takes time for these things to ramp up, but it lines up basically perfectly. And so, yes, that is observational data. It's not a randomized controlled trial, but we don't have the choice in this case. We cannot do a randomized controlled trial. So we have to make the best of the data that we have. And I mean, this also comes down to trust for me. Like, I'm not an expert in climate science at all, but there are hundreds and probably thousands of scientists around the world working on this who have been working on this for a long, long time. And I trust them. Again, like the problem comes down to, well, how do you make other people trust them? And I don't know the answer to that question.
Another question, what type of, whoops, just lost my question here. What type of statistics have you studied?
I used to hate statistics in school. And then, so one of the people I interviewed for this book, her name is Regina Nuzzo, and she's wonderful. She is or was a professor of statistics at Gallaudet University. And for some reason, she was very willing to field my question. I mean, I probably emailed with her about 100 times back and forth on things. And she gave me basically a crash course in the type of statistics that scientists use and misuse in their studies. And usually that revolves around something called the p-value. It's known as inferential statistics. And it's basically a couple of different theories on how to tell if two groups of numbers are different from each other or not. And that's a very specialized, like, sub statistics that is taught. So it's taught in colleges, but Regina told me that it's mistaught, right? A lot of people teach it wrong because it's usually not a statistician that's teaching it. It's usually a scientist who learned it from another scientist who learned it from a different scientist who learned it maybe like 4 degrees back from a statistician. And by the time the message, it's like a game of telephone, by the time the message gets to the end, it's so garbled that, you know, it's unusable. I don't know if you've heard of any of the replicability or reproducibility crises in science, but you know, some part of that comes down to this sort of misunderstanding of inferential statistics. So that's the part, and I have like probably half a chapter or so of that in the book. That's the thing that I studied most closely, particularly for this book, inferential statistics.
That was a really good question. Thank you for the person who asked that. 90 people with coronavirus sounds like such a small number. How do we know it's a large enough sample size? What if 50 people got corona, or 10?
So this is a great question, and the answer, how do we know it's enough, comes down to actually something about the process of how these studies are done. So before you enroll in an ideal world, okay, before you enroll a single participant in a study, you do math. You say to yourself, okay, if I enroll 60,000 people and 38,000 of them get the vaccine, and the overall prevalence rate of COVID-19 just out in the population is, let's say, 1%. So you've got a 1% chance of, you know, these people, then you would expect X number of people to get the thing over time, to get COVID-19 over time. So you do all this math and you say to yourself, okay, at what point am I 80% sure that, or you can use whatever threshold you want, but at what point am I 80 or 90% sure that the difference in people who got COVID-19 versus people, the difference in people who got COVID-19 in the vaccinated group, in the unvaccinated group versus the vaccinated group, right? At what point am I 80% sure that the difference between those two numbers is like significant and real? So you do all that math beforehand, and then again, thanks to inferential statistics, you get a p-value, which is, people like to say it's the probability that the result was due to random chance. That's actually not at all what it means, but you can think of it as a measure of surprise, like 90 people in the unvaccinated group getting it versus 5 people in the vaccinated group getting it. The p-value for that was something like 0.001. And the smaller the p-value is, the more surprising those results would be if they were entirely due to random chance, right? So you're looking for as small of a p-value as possible. You calculate in advance the difference you would need to hit a certain p-value. And you say to yourself, before you enroll anyone, you say to yourself, okay, that's the goal I'm shooting for. And if I don't get that goal, then the vaccine is not effective. Now, 90 and 5 does sound small, but in this case, the math works. And the longer, and by the way, the trials are going to be ongoing, right? So people are going to continue to monitor everyone in these trials, and the cases will accumulate. And we'll see over the next, 2-3 months whether the ratio will stay roughly the same. Like, does it end up being 200 to 10 and then 400 to 20, et cetera? Or does the ratio change? I mean, my expectation is that the ratio will stay basically the same. If it changes, I mean, you can bet we'll hear about it one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's reassuring. Now, Greg Mort would like to know, what do you think of the problem of proposing a theory and then creating experiments that are designed to verify your theory and prove it right?
Yeah, that's not science. So you want to do the opposite of that, right? And I think it was Richard Feynman who said the trick is to not fool yourself. And so he would consider, you come up with this grand theory and then you say, okay, how can I prove this theory right? Like, guaranteed, humans are intelligent. Disproving things, right? You build a theory and then you start to attack it in every way possible. So what you want to do is create experiments that, if they are successful, they would start to chip away at the theory. And that sounds weirdly perverse, like masochistic in a way. But in order for your theory to stand the test of time, eventually other people are going to try and disprove it, right? You want to do whatever you can to try and disprove it first. And most likely what will end up happening is you'll refine the theory, it'll become a little less grand, it'll apply only to certain situations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the end of it, you have your theory, which is in a better shape than where you started. And then you have a bunch of experiments where you tried to disprove it and partially failed to disprove it. And then over time, it's sort of like you start with a big old hunk of marble and then chip away at it, and slowly you end up with a statue that's beautiful. Over time, as other people also try to chip away at your theory, whether it stands the test of time or not, the more they fail at disproving your theory, the better it will stand the test of time. So I would say, Greg, proposing a theory and then creating experiments that are designed to prove it correct is not science.
Okay, now to a narrower question. Why do you think that Moderna and Pfizer virus vaccines need to be kept so cold?
Great question. So they are both made of messenger RNA, which is kind of like DNA in that it will code for a protein. And in this case, the protein it codes for is the spike protein on the outer surface of the coronavirus. And when the mRNA is injected into you, it gets into your cells, your body reads that messenger RNA and starts producing the spike protein. And then your immune system says, what the hell is this? We have to kill it immediately. And then it puts it into its memory banks. So if it ever sees the real spike protein, it can react more quickly and aggressively. So vaccines are immune system training programs. So mRNA is like DNA, but it's a lot less stable than DNA. If you leave mRNA out at room temperature, it will break itself apart very quickly. Lowering the temperature slows down pretty much every chemical reaction that I know of. So the colder you keep the vaccines, the more intact RNA will actually be in that syringe when you go to inject it into a person. It's kind of like, meat. You keep it in your fridge to keep it from going bad. But mRNA degrades a lot faster than meat.
Okay. So Robert Krim has asked another question, which is a really good one. What makes you hopeful about the future of science in our world?
Yeah, that's a great question. Science, so, my experience with these nutrition studies at first was dispiriting because I would read, coffee is good for you. And then I'd read coffee's bad for you. And then I'd read, no, coffee's actually good for you. And then I'd read, oh, actually, no, coffee is bad for you. And it would go on and on and on. And, at first I sort of threw up my arms and I was like, what on earth is going, like, what am I supposed to believe? But then when I zoomed out and saw it as a process rather than a series of individual isolated findings, that process is someone does a study, someone else reads a study and says, well, that's BS. I'm going to prove this wrong. They do a different study that refutes the original study. Then you got a third person who says, no, both of you are wrong. I'm going to do my own thing. And over time, you end up with, a convincing body of knowledge generated ironically sometimes from ambition and like people whose careers want to get ahead, but you have this sort of adversarial and sometimes collaborative process which hones knowledge. And so when I started seeing things as a process, that's when I was like, oh, this actually, it makes sense why there are conflicting results about coffee or eggs or whatever. This is science working as it should be slowly over time to build up truth. And a lot of the times, especially with food, we don't know what that truth is yet. If you had asked me 10 years ago, well, is coffee good or bad for you? I would not have a clear answer for you. I'd say, well, there's some evidence saying that it's good for certain things. There's some evidence saying it's bad for other things. I don't think we know yet. That's still mostly true, although recently someone did actually do a meta-analysis of coffee where they reviewed, I think it was something like 200 or 300 studies and a million participants across all these studies. And broadly, like, coffee seems to be maybe a little bit good for you, but also like not bad for you in most cases, unless you're a pregnant woman. And it's coffee. It's not anything that, like, it's not poison. No one's going to immediately die from drinking coffee. So I'm comfortable saying, like, yeah, you're fine drinking coffee. But it took a long, long time for science to get there. But that actually makes me confident in the results and confident in science as a process.
So then, what do you think of Michael Pollan's advice? If you can't pronounce it and grandma didn't use it, then you shouldn't eat it.
So I know a lot of people who swear by that advice. I don't. I think grandma probably ate a lot of stuff that was very easy to pronounce, but not good for you. Like, I don't know, Spam or pound cake or snickerdoodles or something like that. And your life expectancy is probably higher than your grandmother's was. So I'm not sure why there's this like idolizing of grandma's diet. So I'd listen to her wisdom, would not try and copy her diet. The whole, like, if you can't pronounce it, don't eat it thing, that drives me a little crazy. So, and the reason is chemicals, the way chemicals are named, one chemical can have 40 different names, and they can range from like really easy to pronounce to impossible to pronounce. So if I tell you that something contains 1-alpha D glucopyranosyl 2-beta D fructofuranoside, you'd think I was like trying to sell you poison, but that's just sugar. That is another name for sugar. the name of a chemical tells you how the FDA regulates ingredients labels. It does not tell you anything about how safe or unsafe the chemical is. So that part of Michael Pollan's advice drives me a bit crazy.
All right. Thank you. How can a non-scientist judge, this is from Lois Taylor, the impact of funding on studies? How do we tell if the fact that a particular industry distorted the underlying assumptions in study design and therefore the ultimate results?
That is a hotly debated and unresolved question, especially among scientists who do and don't receive financial support from industries that they study. I mean, typically you're expected to publish anything that could be construed as a conflict of interest when you publish a paper. You say, you know, I read a paper recently that it was something like, you know, walnuts increase or reduce heart disease risk by 40% or something like that. And then at the bottom it says, you know, this research was supported by the California Walnut Commission. And you're like, of course it was, you know? So, I mean, it comes down to how skeptical are you? Like, especially with food science, you know, funding from industry is a part of food science because government funding is not enough. And so, you know, studies of sugar or fat or what have you are not funded to the extent they need to be by the government. So, you know, who steps in to fill the vacuum but like Coca-Cola? I make a note of it whenever I'm reading a study. And it probably causes me to like be 10 or 20% more skeptical. It doesn't cause me to immediately say, oh, this is BS, I'm gonna ignore it completely. But I do read the results of the paper with a little bit more skepticism than I ordinarily would.
What keeps you juiced up about science?
Everything. It's so cool. I mean, if you follow the science pages of the New York Times or whatever publication you want, you will see the weirdest stuff that nature has to offer. I mean, you know, shrimp that fire, the shrimp that like punch things faster than the speed of sound, plants that shoot things 6 feet across the room. I mean, the weirdest things happen in the scientific world. And it's such a place of variety and intrigue and interest, much more so than, you know, what's happening on the latest soap opera. I think that's the thing that keeps me very interested, is just like how weird the world around us is and how exciting it is.
Thank you, George Zaidan. You've given us a lot to think about, and you've done it very engagingly. We appreciate it.
And we're really thrilled that you came to talk to us, and hope you'll come back sometime when there are more answers.
If you want to wait for more answers, call me in 15 years.
Hold your book up one more time so everybody gets a look at it.
There it is.
Okay. Yeah, it's whoever did you think up that cover?
Nope. This was the publisher. They had a designer who just sort of went nuts and did a whole bunch.
A big Cheeto on the front?
A big Cheeto on the front. Yep.
Who wouldn't love a Cheeto? So yeah, that's so great. Allison, do you want to have the last word?
Oh, just to thank George so much for coming. Thank you for my guest moderators for the evening. And just to wish everybody a happy and healthy holiday season. And we hope to see you in January when History Happy Hours start back up again.